Welcome to Meeple Arts, a discussion of visual design for board games. I am Greg Grimsby, and let's get started with episode 3. Well, welcome everyone to this episode of Meeple Arts. I am Greg Grimsby, and I'm excited to have a special guest with us today. We're going to be talking with Dann May, and I'm excited to look over the work that he's done and talk about art direction with him. So with that, Dan, a brief introduction from you. Let's hear about some of your early career and what brings you here today.
Thanks, Greg. So I have worked quite a lot as an art director in tabletop games, probably for the last 10 years, and also worked as a graphic designer, illustrator, game developer, product designer. So sort of beginning with visual arts and then sort of moving more into the product design, game development side of things in the last 5 years. So I've worked on some fairly well-known games. So I worked on Everdell, which is probably one of the best known, and then probably about 100 other projects of varying degrees of notoriety. I'm happy to chat really about anything that we want to chat about in terms of art and games. I mean, I was really attracted initially to get into this industry because of the presentation of the games, and I just saw like a great opportunity to do some really amazing things with the art and the aesthetics of the way games are presented. And I think it's a really important part of what makes board games great and special, and that you can do a lot to enhance the experience of the gameplay with great presentation. And I particularly, having done the game development things as well, I find thinking of the presentation as you're developing the game, or even vice versa, sometimes presentation ideas can come, or a thematic idea can come that you then start to incorporate into the gameplay and develop things that way. So I find that merger between the art and the gameplay is a really exciting space to create, and there's a lot of great possibilities that you can create.
Awesome.
Thinking that way.
Well, I'm going to bring up our concept board here and see if we can find some examples to talk about your process and how you function as an art director.
Yeah.
But I am really fascinated by what you said about how board games as a visual design space is so rewarding. I would love to hear you kind of describe like what is the most rewarding aspect of being an art director in board games, and maybe in comparison, if you've done some art direction in other fields, how does it compare, and what are the things that you really do like love it and stay keep doing it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, definitely one part of it is that every project is very different. As a creative person that looks for novelty and new things to explore and new challenges, just the range of themes, the range of products and their scales and their target audiences, and there's all sorts of different interesting projects that you can get into. And I also think that games, it's sort of the perfect project for an artist or a graphic designer in a way, because it's this very contained product. You're almost sort of creating an entire space there that players can move in. There's elements of graphic communication, so you have to think about the functionality and the presentation. You're also thinking about the thematic and the storytelling elements. You have tactile elements to it. So people that, I came from part of my background was in, print design and corporate ID with some of the stuff that I did earlier on. So, I'd always just love the feel of different paper textures or, just material objects, and being able to create in that space is really fun. And then also, expanding that to the way that the art integrates with the graphic design is really, really exciting. Because like I say, it's a game, it's got rules, and it's got these functional requirements to it. So there's that interesting challenge, but then combining that with the artwork in, beautiful ways and evocative ways is just a really, really fun challenge, I think. And also, you know, just like I say, getting back to what I said to begin with, you know, like different projects, it's this whole other kind of, you know, research, you know, process that you might go through for a game. You know, like we did recently, Uru, which was influenced by Indonesian art, and we worked with an Indonesian artist, Ingarada Rasa, on it, which had a whole other completely different sort of headspace that you need to get into. And you're trying to create that, you know, space that when people play it, they can sort of like come into that space as well and have that sort of feeling and that aesthetic immerse themselves in. And then another game, you know, like Everdell, which is something that we created really from scratch and just dreamt up an entire world. That's like another different process. So definitely being able to jump from project to project and see things in a new way is super exciting. It's also really great too because, you know, you can do a lot yourself. So a lot of these projects are quite small teams. So you end up with really great creative collaborations with just a few people, and to be able to, you know, you can do a lot, you know, like they say with tabletop games, you know, to design them, you know, the barrier of entry is very low. You know, maybe you need some pen and paper really to begin with to get into it, you know. And while there are a lot of things that you can learn about making the games and the technicalities, and, you know, obviously you need to build your talents, at the end of the day, it's still quite, you know, it could be quite a small team and quite a sort of intimate sort of process, which is a lot of fun as well. You know, you're not just a modeler on a, you know, a video game and you're creating these models and you're one part of this giant, you know, machine.
That's
you're
my
actually,
background, so I hear you.
Yes, you're able to have that overview. So with something like Everdell, you know, that was really a team of 4 people, and, you know, people. So James and his wife, the designer, myself, my wife Brenna, and Andy Bosley, really pretty much just sort of covered every base in that process and just built that up. And also like that there's a lot of crossover really in the roles, you know, and I enjoy that because it's a small team, you know, everyone sort of like chips in here and there, you know. So for instance, like, you know, James would talk with me about art direction. I would talk to him about you know, game design. We'd work on the development. So there's something just very satisfying about being able to, you know, bring a lot of that stuff together in one. I guess it's like the next step up. You know, if you think about writing a novel, that's something you would do by yourself. And like creating a film or a video game, that's something you do with, you know, 10 to 100 to 1,000 people. Whereas board games is just in this nice sort of space in terms of the scope, you know, it tends to be sort of in that range from, you know, 2 to 7 people somewhere, which I find just a nice kind of nice space.
Awesome. Well, I've zoomed up on Everdell here on the concept board, and when I look at the game, and I think players who have responded so well to this game, it's done very well. It's done very well through expansions and on Kickstarter. I find the components are so transporting, and they're just perfect choices of components to kind of support the theme. The color palette is a wonderful earthen palette, and it is transporting. I find it very immersive.
Thanks.
And I'm sure it was a journey to get to, you know, the product that we're seeing now. And I would love to hear the kind of early seeds of that look development. Did you have any key art, or were they just descriptions, or did you or Andrew do some kind of like establishing piece that kind of set, you know, kind of set the feel of the world? Just would love to hear how this amazing looking game came to be.
Yeah. Every project is different. So this is different as any other project. So it does have its own little peculiar kind of story to it. So really it started with, we played the game, and we liked the game. And at the time it had sort of a medieval theme. It had a few sort of like fantasy creatures in it, but they were sort of like, it was more in that sort of high fantasy sort of mold. And just through playing the game and just through getting a feel for it, there were the seasons were in it to begin with. And just for sort of, just through playing it, I think I sort of intuited that this would, the feeling of it and the scale of it just felt like it would fit better with like a woodland theme. It just felt like the scale of it felt a little bit smaller, if that makes sense, a little bit tighter and but richer at the same time. So I suggested that to James, and James was really excited about changing the theme and going in that direction. And as we were thinking that, the part of that process is also just trying to imagine what's going to sort of unify the mechanics, I guess, and this theme. And so ideas about, the pebbles, the twigs. And the way I thought about it was like the literal kind of scale of, I wanted to sort of do it in a way where it hinted at more like an actual scale of something you were playing. So rather than it being like you're getting logs and you're getting, stone or different things that are more abstracted, I sort of wanted to see if we could kind of like bring it down to almost a level where it's like these are almost kind of the size of the actual things that these little creatures would be doing.
Yeah.
I felt like that would create like a little bit more of a toy feeling to it and feel more immersive with the game. So just even as we were thinking about the theme and changing the theme, that was in mind, I think, about how do we make this space feel sort of more intimate and integrated, I think. And then we also talked a bit about, we want sort of coming off that, we started to think about the design, some of these design ideas around that. So we wanted it to be sort of like a realistic place. We wanted it to feel like if you're going to take a pebble and you're going to take a twig and you're going to put these together and make a little house, we sort of wanted to feel like when we got to the stage of the art, we wanted to see that in the art. We wanted to see this sort of rustic kind of grounded sort of realistic art. We didn't want it to feel too cartoony or too childish. We wanted it to feel like a little bit grounded in some sort of reality. And so that then led me to think about art. And I think I just had been looking around and I actually saw a piece of Andy's. I must have been browsing somewhere. I just saw a piece of Andy's that it had a certain atmospheric quality to it that I just thought this has a sense of place to it. I really wanted to get that sense of place into it. And it wasn't actually a little critter or anything like that. It was just like a picture, like a stone column or something in a forest with some fog and stuff. But I thought this could definitely fit. And so I looked through Andy's folio. I don't think I remember seeing anything critterish in it. But I still felt like he was a really good option. And then we met up at Gen Con that year. I said, let's just get together and we'll chat about it. And then I met Andy and I just I had this really good feeling just from the way he talked about it, when we talked about the animal theme with him, that, he was just the man for the job. Like I could just tell. It can be a little bit, obviously you do a lot of thinking in the background, but a lot of these things do happen on this other level. There's a little bit of a destiny aspect to some of these projects, I think. And just being able to identify things, especially as an art director, a big part of what you're doing is you're trying to identify potentials. You're not necessarily, and there's two ways to do it. The way I've always done it is I've always looked at the artwork and the project first, and then sort of thought about, okay, so how can we make this, how is this going to work? How is this going to fit? Once an artist comes on that you feel good about, they're going to then bring something extra to it again, and they're going to take it to another level. But I don't really necessarily need to look through a portfolio and say, here's some critters, Andy can do it, so, but at the same, but Andy was like, I've always wanted to do critters, that's something I've always wanted to do. So I sort of look at it like, well, maybe, I saw something in that one piece that, identified perhaps that, this would be some sort of uh, something that he could enjoy and love and everything as well. So as soon as you find that mix and people are really into the project, then it just starts to snowball.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so what then happened is uh, we went through a lot of the cards, and myself, James, and Breno basically just reshaped a lot of the thematic elements that were in the prototype so that they would start to form this world, so we started to invent these different characters and different roles for different things. So we talked a bit about we don't really want to have necessarily like a woodsman just chopping down trees. Let's just see what else we can do. So then we sort of thought, let's do like a toad that travels down the river on a barge and collects twigs. And so and then we're really big on how do we make that fit with the gameplay. So if a card had a certain quality to it and a certain ability to it that was doing one thing, we would really look to, okay, so what is this thing? What's the best way to express this thematically? And so then when we brought Andy on, we had all that stuff there. We kind of knew broadly what we were going to do. And then it was the luxury of really being able to say to Andy, look, we want to, and I've talked to Andy about this as well, and we kind of share this philosophy of, art in general is just sort of like you're showing a small window essentially, but you want to create something that, you can kind of imagine what's beyond the edges of that window. So we weren't asking Andy for, full stories in these pictures, and we weren't asking him for like just a plain character. It was very much like, let's just create the suggestion of the world, and that was part of that atmosphere that we wanted to capture. The idea that, I love that. It's always something I've always loved in art is, if you look at a picture and you see like a path leading off and there's like a beam of light down around behind a tree, and you just sort of think, what's down that path? What's going to draw me in? What, to imagine like what's over that next hill, or, where's this character heading?
Yeah. I think
all those little indications.
I think that's part of the social contract that gamers have with their game, is that they don't want everything specifically laid out. Like
absolutely,
they are board gamers. We are board gamers, so
yeah.
we want to have evocative, immersive imagery that we're gonna still fill in the blanks a
absolutely.
good bit. But good art is gonna kind of inspire that to happen and do just enough world building that we can kind of fill in the rest.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, players, the biggest resource that you have when you create any of these games, I mean, I started with role-playing games. So I resisted board games for a long time, because I was all about theater of the mind, imagination, and freedom to do this. And when I really got into board games, it was really when I realized that, and, it intersected with my other professional work, that, you can do a lot with just by suggesting things and letting players still fill in these gaps and imagine things. You want to create, I sort of think about it a little bit like a play set. You want to create something that people can tell their own stories with. And I think the best games are games that really leverage players' imagination and their own ability to tell stories. I sort of tend to recoil a little bit from, like even from scenario-based systems that, dictate kind of like what happens next in these big chunks. I'm much more of a sandbox, person. I really love that feeling. I still think you can guide people and you can help give them, toys to play with. But when I play, that's the experience I want to have. I want to be able to like put two things together and have something come out of that I can, find the connections and make the stories from. So that was a big philosophy with Everdell, and that's probably even though every project is different, that's probably a broad philosophy that I tend to follow.
I want to ask Dan, when you're working as an art director on a project, when do you normally? I know you say every project's different, and I think there's a lot of people who might be watching this, and maybe if they're not an artist, they're a designer, they go, well, I can't afford an art director early on. But maybe some of that's out of ignorance, like they don't know how to engage with an art director. They don't maybe see the value that they offer. So I'm really curious to hear, especially maybe for this project, like when were you brought on board, and how does that relationship typically develop for you with the designer or the developer of a game?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, for this project, I was employed, so I was the creative director at Starling Games when this project happened. So this was a project that I scouted and essentially, along with the rest of the team, we signed that game
Okay.
and developed it through from scratch. And obviously, having a range of skills or being able to be involved in the art direction, the graphic design, and the game development, yeah, it does give you that ability to oversee things through to the end. So I do tend to believe that some sort of holistic approach to designing games is of benefit. It isn't necessarily like the traditional way that games have been designed. It's much more been a game designer designs it and they have a theme, and that theme may work really well with the game, but it may be that once it gets to the next stage, the publisher steps in and changes the theme. So it's much more of a linear,
Mm-hmm.
sort of a linear approach. That's something that the new studio that I founded, Cool Silver Studio, that we try and do is we try and provide a different, a way for designers and publishers to sort of gain a little bit of that knowledge a bit earlier. So we do some of the projects we work on. We'll have like development consultations with different publishers and designers. And because we're aware of those, the art direction, we're aware of presentation things. When we're talking game development, those are things which kind of come into that discussion. They become part of the sort of the design development discussion naturally when you have that that skill set there in the mix. So I think it's definitely tricky for like someone that's just a single designer, I think, to be able to maybe factor in a lot of those things.
Yeah.
Some people are going to definitely do that. I mean, there's designers that are illustrators, and that will take the game all the way through and have that vision to take things through. I just think I feel like it's undeniable that many games would benefit from having a little bit more of a total product strategy and approach, from earlier on.
Yeah.
Some games maybe don't need it. They happen to just sort of hit that line, and everything lines up and it comes out great at the end. Mm-hmm. But definitely a lot of projects. I think Everdell's like a prime example. I think if we hadn't have done that development, we hadn't have changed it to the woodland theme, we hadn't have worked it in a certain way. I mean, it's a good game and it's a solid game, but I think it definitely came to life through that process. And I think James has said as much. That it definitely elevated that to a level where a lot of what we're trying to do. We try to design games, but a lot of what we're trying to do is make things stand out. It's a crowded market.
Yeah.
So you're sort of trying to create things that are like best in class or different. You got to create something new or something that's better than something similar. And to do that, you've got to really leverage every part of that product.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can leverage the presentation, you can leverage, like toy factor or table presence or narrative or world building or and that doesn't mean you want to throw everything in there. It's still about balancing that and finding the right mix so everything can shine through at the right amount. But yeah, like I think if you can leverage all those different elements at least at some point during the process, it just gives that game an edge over other titles.
Yeah, I feel like Everdell actually it sits in a pretty kind of unique space with the critters. They're yes, they're adorable, but they are grounded in a certain level of realism. And I think of stories I read when I was a kid, like Munchkin, not the game, but Munchkin the mouse. So I go back to some of that early childhood illustrations that I encountered, and so when I first saw this game, I was like, wow, that reminds me of that, and I thought it was cool.
Yeah.
And
Well,
Yeah, just excellent
Yeah,
work in
thanks.
terms of coming up with a visual that both matches the game, but that still feels like it has its own kind of unique presence in the board game space.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean some of the things you mentioned there, bring to mind some of the other considerations that are there. That we talk a lot of it is really about who the game's for as well.
Hmm.
And trying to think about if you've got a certain gameplay, who ultimately is going to love this game? Where is this going to fit?
Hmm.
I would think of things like, this is like imagining like Sunday afternoon game. We'd say like it's Sunday afternoon, the sun's coming in, you got a cup of tea, with your family, and then that's the feeling. It's you sort of so therefore emphasize that, make that a better experience. And I think games, definitely have different target audiences, and understanding sort of where to cast that net as well. Like I knew Everdell it's not a simple game, but it's relatively simple. It has like
Hmm.
every turn you do one thing. It's very basic. You're either going to play a card or place the worker or pass for the season. And so just sort of understanding that idea that you want something that for this particular project, it was like, we know we want something that a gamer or someone that's sort of in the hobby game could like put this in front of someone that maybe was on the edge of that, and it would bring them into the hobby and get them involved. So some of that is, really about the pitch as far as like, how welcoming the game is,
Hmm.
and so I think, yeah, that things like nostalgia, like you mentioned, or recognizable, familiar, grounding things, even when you're being, imaginative, it can be really important. I remember listening to an interview a long time ago about pop music and the advance of music, and I used to be a musician, and the idea that you can be too experimental at any point. That
Hmm.
the stuff that tends to be the most uh, successful, or people are able to like get into in any art form, tends to be something that innovates, but it still is able to reference things that people are familiar with. So bring
Yeah.
something new to something that they already love, and thinking about that in general with art direction and presentations, is pretty key, I think.
Well, Dan, you have a lot of amazing stuff here on the board, and I want to make sure we have time to at least focus in on maybe one more piece, because this could take days to talk about all this great stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so I do want to at least spend a moment to reference this wonderful color scheme reference that you have included as we really get into the nuts and bolts of how do you communicate a vision to someone working on a project, whether you're the or how do you receive that art direction. So I would
Yep.
love if you could just talk about just a few minutes, like what this project was and what you're trying to establish in this layout of color and some sample scenery, so someone looking at this would have a better sense of how they could produce something like this. Presumably, someone who's an artist who does have to take on some responsibility for some art direction. Hopefully you can give some guidance in how this would be useful for them.
Yeah. Okay. So with a lot of projects, like you could release an artist on a project and they do great work, and a lot of it is just really what you're doing as an art director is you're really just trying to focus their efforts so that it's going to harmonize with things like the gameplay, the graphic design, general atmosphere. So with something like this example, what we're doing is we're sort of solving some sort of big graphical problems essentially for the graphic designer and for the artist, so that they can really just do what they need to do in that in a certain defined limitation space. Like limitations aren't a bad thing; they can be super helpful, as long as they give the artists enough room to move. So that's kind of the art of doing good art direction, I think, is being able to give artists some limitations and guidance, but you don't want to be micromanaging them. You want them to be able to do what they can do.
Mm.
Um,
Yep.
and so with a game like this is an upcoming game called Citrus by a designer called Sean Lee, who came to us at Quill Silver. So he's designed a cyberpunk board game. It's quite a expansive game, has a lot going on, a lot of pieces moving around, a lot of different colors, player colors, colors for resources, colors for locations. And what you tend to find with a lot of those games that do that, and you find a lot with prototypes, is there'll be a lot of like double ups. This is a very basic thing, but there'll be a lot of double ups. So there's a red player, a green player, a yellow player, a blue player, and then there's a red location and there's a blue location. And it's like, do these things relate to each other? No, they're just the same color, because they're the four colors, like on a very simple level. And colors are going to have thematic relevance as well. So there's going to be certain things in the game that you want to tell with the story that are going to sort of become like a bit of a visual language in the game. And so you're looking to sort of like, as an art director, you're looking to find ways to use that space to kind of at once clarify things from a gameplay point of view, and also direct things thematically. So a graphic designer can definitely do that. Like a graphic designer could come in and organize these colors and find a way to sort of select the color palette. But as an art director, you're thinking a little bit more big picture. So you're thinking about what sort of pieces of art are going to be used here. What's the style of the art? How tight are the color schemes within these pieces of art, and how does it relate to the gameplay? So in this game, you can see there's like four pictures in the middle there. These are sort of the four main regions of this play space. And so we're looking to kind of clearly identify these regions as four very different sorts of regions in the play space. And at the same time, we're looking to have some sort of commonality, so it doesn't just become, very, very different things. So luckily enough, like the sort of style of art that I think would suit this game is kind of almost like duotone. So there's like a primary color that is the main color for that location, and then there's a very limited palette or one other color that just complements that primary color. And another thing you're trying to do is, you're not trying to overload things. So it's a big topic, but obviously, you can see a game that, tools like very good at this is you can have a lot of stuff going on, a lot of colors, but it doesn't seem fragmented. You're able to sort of combine things in different ways and create like a larger composition, so all the details don't just razzle and become like too much information. So part of what you're trying to do with that art direction is just to try and organize that space and create that space that's there's the right balance between the different sort of levels of detail and large picture.
So are these images that so you made this color board, and then this was communicated to folks who had to then like produce more illustrations? Or I'm just trying to understand like where the original imagery came from that fed this color board, and then how it was leveraged and then informed additional work that came later in the project.
Yeah. So this color board is actually from all found images. So this is just things that I've just grabbed online. So it's essentially a Pinterest board, personal Pinterest board. But that will vary from project to project. Some projects will actually get in and we'll do samples and we will experiment more. This project was much more focused on, let's just sort of get this big picture direction for the client.
Awesome.
And really, all those considerations around, what color something's going to be or how it's going to sort of balance. I think it is really about balancing all these different competing needs of the game and finding the way to balance that all. So, the graphic design working with the illustration is very important. And if you can find a way to do that in a way where they enhance each other and enhance the gameplay, then that's very simple. You know, if you can do that creatively for that particular theme, that can be really strong. So in this game, you know, very, very simple. You know, the orange resource is going to, which is like a fire energy resource cube thing, is going to come from this place. It has this orange theme.
Awesome. Yeah.
You know, it is thematically going to fit with, you know, the artwork. And then, you know, the player colors are going to be in a slightly different sort of color space. Even things like I've mentioned here, you know, player colors tend to be bright or dark, mostly bright. And the signature colors tend to be mid-toned on the locations. So it's even considering things like, you know, how the colors relate to each other in the space. You know, if I've got to put a blue token on this board, is it going to stand out? You know, so therefore the art will tend to be darker and moodier with some highlights, and then the player colors are going to sort of pop out. I mean, sometimes you'll do entirely different color gamuts for a particular part of the game. So something like Archmage, we had fairly bright colors for the artwork, but then the player colors were quite sort of muted. So we used like white, brown, like a gray, and like a kind of a muted blue. Archmage is the one in the top left image there at the bottom right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So in the, I don't know if you can, this image on there's an image with 4 different projects on it, and it has, if you go left.
This one, okay.
Yes, that one in the bottom right there. It's a little bit hard to see.
Yeah.
But we had 6 really bold colors for the colors of Magic, and so we used like more muted colors for the players and sort of almost in a different color space. And that can just help to sort of separate things out and into little sort of categories. So you can have this really lavish presentation of all this stuff going on, but you know, it still feels like this little section of the game has its own feeling to it.
I love the board presence that you've got here.
Thanks.
I see that as a common theme across all the work that I'm seeing, and I'm sure that's to some degree your philosophy, you know, bearing out on these projects. But from these people sitting in the thrones, kind of arrayed around, and that wonderful hourglass to, of course, Everdell has an amazing tree. I think table presence is super important, both for differentiation, but also for immersing that player. It feels like this is something that you definitely are constantly thinking about. Do you have any kind of just suggestions about how to think about that presence, whether it's thinking about it early and often, or just being aware of what components can do for your project, or what do you have to say about table presence? And then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk again at some time when we've got more time if you're interested. Yeah, so it is something to consider, you know, throughout the process. I think it is something to consider. I feel like, I mean, there's different ways you can approach it, and you're definitely having a knowledge of what's possible is like really important, I think. And you can get that from other games. You know, you can see what other games can do. I mean, one sort of little bit of a silly thing is, for some reason, like the last 3 or 4 games I've worked on have all had circular boards. I don't know why.
They're
but
beautiful. They're really just so pleasing.
It just kind of happened that way. And you know, like with a game like Buru, you know, it's a mandala, and you know, it was just fitting the theme and the way the game played and everything to just make it a circle, you know.
Those boat cutouts are just wonderful. I mean, that shape, that negative shape it makes against the table, it's just so nice to look at.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think having a knowledge of what you can do, and in that space, and you know, there's a certain sculptural element to creating a board game.
Oh, great word.
You know,
yeah.
And my brother Greg, who's partner with me in Quilsilver, he sculpted the minis and sculpted all the any game that I've worked on. He's always worked on the 3D elements. And yeah, and you know, something like the tree, you know, in Everdell, it's just thinking of it in terms of a 3D space, and when it comes to the components and the tactile feel of what the components are going to be, all that stuff. Just, I mean, the squishy berries in Everdell, you know, this is one example. You know, just it's just there's lots of possibilities in this space. I think that's what makes it so exciting, is that there's a lot of different fun things that still remain to be done. You know, so I think any game that someone's creating, you know, tomorrow, you know, there's so much space to explore from presentation, mechanical point of view. You know, the way components can work with the game. That, yeah, I just think the only advice I would generally have is just sort of embrace that as a possibility. And you know, you often hear like, oh, a game looks pretty, but is it a good game? You know, there's still a little bit of that in the industry, that, you know, it's fading out. But that idea that, you know, like, well, presentation is just fluff, you know, there's still a little bit of that around. And I think that, you know, we're definitely at the point now where I think the more that we do this, and you know, the more projects that come out where people are really thinking about, you know, presentation on that higher level. And I think most of the good games that come out now do that. That, you know, the more and more we're going to kind of see the interconnectivity there, I think, between the artwork, the graphic design, and the gameplay experience that players have. So there's not really any easy answer, but it is definitely something to not be daunted by, but just kind of celebrate the possibilities of, I think, is the way I would kind of think about it, and be open to seeing that as a potential way to progress your game. You know, like, for instance, again, like with Everdell, you know, like, sometimes a theme or a presentation idea can actually re-inspire and reinvigorate development and design. You know, as a designer, you know, if you can happen upon a component idea that may unleash another possibility in the game mechanics. You know, you go to like a thick tile that can be stacked, and oh, now I've got, you know, this other possibility with, you know, that I can use verticality in the mechanics, or you know, different shaped tiles that can potentially look different ways. There's just different, or, you know, like a new theme is the obvious one. You create a new theme, and then suddenly it's like, oh wow, you know, now I can look at these characters in this way, and this makes sense. And oh, what if we did this now? You know, so there's definitely a lot that can come from thinking of games, you know, just in terms of their aesthetics, you know, and how they're presented. And I think that I think more and more people are definitely just appreciating and, you know, enjoying that part of the game for its, you know, for its own sake, you know, some of the time. So I think people respond to it, you know, and if you know, if it's something you enjoy and it's something that you feel you can contribute to, I think as an artist and a graphic designer, it's like definitely a great space to play.
Awesome. I think that's a great message, and we've seen some wonderful examples in your work of how visual design can impact the game in such meaningful ways, and not just in terms of enhancing the experience, but actually changing the original design's theme. And I'm sure it changes mechanisms in some cases. So you kind of respond to art and respond to components. And I just love how you described a very collaborative relationship between the visual designers and leaders of a project and those who are driving the design more specifically. Really awesome way of working, and I appreciate you sharing that with me and my watchers today.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah. So
Thanks.
I could talk with you for hours, but
Yeah, I could as well.
we're gonna wrap up this podcast. I want to thank my watchers for joining us for this session, and definitely thank you, Dan, for spending your precious time to talk art today. If you want to find out more about Meeple Arts, you can visit meeplearts.com. But Dan, if someone wants to find out about your company or your projects, where can they get that information?
Yep. So our website is quillsilver.com. So that's like the pen, quillsilver.com. And you can find us on Twitter at @byquillsilver.
Awesome.
And that's it.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks to Dan for being our guest. If you have any feedback or questions, please email me at greg@meeplearts.com and visit the website meeplearts.com. Thanks for watching.